Let's go through the impairment ratings and how to do impairment ratings, specifically the guidelines to impairments and why they are significant to the chiropractor. And we're going to pay attention to as it relates to chiropractic and the low impact soft tissue spinal injuries. So, why is it important? Well, when you look at the top 5 financial drivers, the first category, in other words, what are the documentation categories that create the most potential injury award? Well, number one is the injury diagnosis. So that tops everything, but right under that is the impairment. Is there an impairment? And then right under the impairment are what are called impairment indexes, meaning are there pain and restrictions, and how are the pain and restrictions relative to activities of daily living? So there you have it. That's why it's so important to understand, know how to give impairment ratings. It's the second most. Bottom line is the injury award. The two most important factors for an injury award is one, was there a permanent impairment? Two, how did that permanent impairment cause permanent pain and restrictions with activities of daily living? That's it right there. That's the pinnacle. That's the pinnacle of an injury award. So we definitely need to know how to do impairment ratings. And that's the importance of impairment ratings relative to a personal injury case. But obviously, it's going to be very important, not just to the patient, but for the attorney. So these are going to be very important findings, and so we have to know the basics. And then it's called the guides. What does that mean? The guides to impairment. The guides means it's not rules. It's not rules. So there's no way they could make a book that has every known disease to man. There's no way. And so it has to be guides. It cannot be rules. What does that mean? Well, it means you got to just know some of the basic guides, and then you have to apply it to your particular impairment that you're dealing with, and it has to make the most sense. And by the way, that's who that anytime you ask a question in personal injury, you always need to think of who the ultimate answer is going to go to, which is a jury. So you have to ask yourself, how does that sound to a jury? Does that make sense to a jury? That's your determination of the answer to any questions you have relative to personal injury. So if it doesn't make much sense to a jury, you probably don't want to use it. And so you want to make sure that whatever it is that you do when you give the impairment, that it does make sense to a jury. In other words, it's logical and progressive, and it just makes sense by the time you put it together. Okay. Now, the reason that's so important is some of these you're going to have to put together. Matter of fact, the most of them. There's only a few of them that there's actually a table to that you can actually just point to the table and go, okay, I'll take that number. That's not the majority. That's only a few. The majority of them you're going to have to decipher, use the guide's principles, and go, okay, this is why I came up with this number. And so if you ever have to testify it in a court of law and you have to explain it to a jury, it makes sense. That's how that works. So we're going to cover the 5th edition of the impairment guides. There are 6 editions, but we're going to cover the 5th. And the reason that we're going to cover the 5th, and the reason we're going to use the 5th, and the reason you want to use the 5th, unless your state says otherwise, and I don't know of a state that forces anybody to do the 6th edition specifically, but the reason you want to use the 5th edition is because it's most specific for the soft tissue spinal injury. That's why. So if they ask, why are you not using the 6th? Why are you not using? That's why. The 5th edition is most specific for the soft tissue spinal injuries that we deal with. Just like you would use the 4th edition if it was most specific for any particular disease condition. So we're using the 5th edition because it is most specific for giving impairment ratings for the soft tissue spinal injury. That's why.